The silence in her apartment was a living thing. It wasn't an empty silence, but a full one, woven from the gentle rustle of turning pages, the soft creak of old leather, and the faint, almost musical ticking of a small brass clock on the wall. For the woman who lived there, this silence was a blanket, a shield, a friend. Her world was shaped by it, defined by it. She was a restorer of old books, a mender of stories that others had forgotten. Her days were spent hunched over a heavy wooden workbench, her tools laid out with the precision of a surgeon. There were tiny bone folders, delicate tweezers, and jars of glue that smelled faintly of honey and vinegar. Her hands, though now marked with age and faint scars, moved with an unshakable grace, coaxing life back into cracked spines and brittle pages. This was her life, a life of quiet order, a life she had built brick by silent brick after the last one had fallen apart. In the corner of the main room, shrouded in a white cloth like a ghost, stood an old upright piano. She hadn't lifted the cloth in years. It was a monument to a different person, a girl with fire in her fingers and a symphony in her heart. A girl who had been scared into silence by the roar of a crowd. That girl was gone, and in her place was this woman, a curator of calm. On a Tuesday, the calm was broken. It wasn't a loud break, but a sharp, insistent knock on her door that echoed through the rooms like a gunshot. Her hand stilled over a 19th century book of poetry, a needle-thin tool poised in mid-air. No one knocked on her door. Deliveries were left in the hallway. Friends, a concept she had mostly outlived, called first. Her heart gave a single hard thump against her ribs. She ignored it, hoping whoever it was would go away, assuming they had the wrong apartment. But the knock came again, 3 more times, firm and patient. It was the knock of someone who knew they were at the right place and had no intention of leaving. With a sigh that felt like a betrayal of her own sanctuary, she wiped her hands on her apron, smoothed her hair, and went to the door. She looked through the peephole, her breath catching in her throat. The man standing in the hallway was a ghost, but not the kind that haunted her piano. He was a ghost from her real life, a life she thought was long dead. He was older now, his hair a brilliant silver, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, but his eyes were the same sharp, intense, and seeing everything. He was her old teacher, the man who had pushed her to the brink of greatness and then watched her fall. She opened the door just a crack. The chain lock taut. "Yes?" Her voice was rusty from disuse. He smiled, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's been a long time," he said, his voice deeper than she remembered, but with the same commanding tone that could silence a room. "May I come in?" She wanted to say no. She wanted to close the door and retreat into her silence, to pretend this interruption never happened. But something in his gaze held her. It was the same look he used to give her when she was about to attempt a difficult passage. A look that said, "I know you can do this, even if you don't." She reluctantly unhooked the chain and let him in. He stepped inside, bringing with him the scent of the outside world cold air, wool, and a faint trace of expensive cologne. He looked around her apartment, his gaze sweeping over the bookshelves, the neat stacks of paper, the tools on her workbench. It was a look of appraisal, and she felt a sudden, fierce urge to protect her quiet life from his judgment. "You've made a beautiful life for yourself," he said, and it didn't sound like a compliment. It sounded like an observation, a statement of fact that implied something else entirely. "I like the quiet," she replied, her arms crossed over her chest. She felt like a student again, caught unprepared. "The quiet can be a good place to visit," he said, turning to face her. "But it's a terrible place to live." He let that hang in the air for a moment before getting to the point. "Alistair Finch is dead." She knew the name. Everyone in the world she had left behind knew the name. Alistair Finch was a composer, a genius, a madman who wrote music that was as beautiful as it was terrifying. "I'm sorry to hear that," she said, though she felt no connection to the news. "He left behind one final piece," the old man continued, ignoring her words. "A sonata. They're calling it the Glass Sonata." He paused, letting the name sink in. "No one has played it. No one can?" "The pianist who was meant to premiere it at the tribute concert." He backed out. Said it was impossible. Said it would break his hands and his mind. She didn't know why he was telling her this. It was a story from a different world, a world of concert halls and critics, a world she had no part of. She just wanted him to leave. He reached into the leather briefcase he had been carrying and pulled out a thick sheaf of paper, bound together at the top. He placed it on her small, cluttered kitchen table. The paper was heavy, cream-colored, and covered in a forest of notes. They were dense, chaotic, sprawling across the page like a dark vine. It looked less like music and more like a map of a very troubled mind. "This is it," he said, his hand resting on the manuscript. "This is Alistair's last message to the world, and it needs to be heard." Her eyes were fixed on the manuscript. She could feel the power of it, even without reading a single note. It was a challenge, a dare, a scream trapped on paper. "Why are you showing me this?" she whispered, her throat dry. "Because everyone else has tried and failed," he said, his voice softening for the first time. "Because they play the notes, but they don't understand the silence between them. You do, you always did. You have a quietness in you that this music needs. It's not about speed, not just about technique. It's about control. It's about holding a piece of glass in your hands and playing a song on it without shattering it." He was looking at her now, really looking at her, and she felt exposed. As if he could see the girl she used to be, the girl who was still hiding somewhere inside her. "No," she said, shaking her head, taking a step back. "I can't. I don't do that anymore. My hands, they're not for that." "Your hands are the most capable hands I have ever known," he said, his voice firm again. "You were the best. You still are?" "I was a failure," she shot back, her voice trembling with an anger that surprised her. "You remember. You were there." "I remember a girl who got scared," he corrected her gently. "I remember a girl who let the fear win. This is your chance to show that fear that it doesn't own you anymore." She shook her head again, more forcefully this time. "No, please, you have to leave." She couldn't breathe. The walls of her quiet apartment were closing in on her, the silence now screaming with the memory of applause, with the ghost of a forgotten melody. He didn't argue. He just nodded slowly, a look of profound disappointment on his face. He walked towards the door, but he stopped with his hand on the knob. "The score stays," he said, not turning around. "The music doesn't care if you're afraid. It only wants to be heard." And with that, he was gone, closing the door softly behind him. The woman stood in the middle of her apartment, her heart hammering against her ribs. The silence rushed back in, but it was different now. It was no longer her friend. It was heavy, thick, and charged with the presence of the manuscript on her table. She walked towards it slowly, as if it were a wild animal. She stared at the cover page, at the spidery handwriting that spelled out the Glass Sonata. It was an impossible piece. A foolish, reckless, impossible piece. And it was sitting on her table, in her quiet home, a challenge to everything she had become. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers hovering just above the notes, afraid to touch them, afraid of what might happen if she did. For days, the manuscript sat on her kitchen table like a heavy stone she couldn't ignore. It was a constant, silent presence in the corner of her eye. She tried to lose herself in her work, to let the familiar comfort of old paper and glue wash over her. She worked on a collection of old letters, their ink faded to a soft brown. Her fingers, usually so steady and sure, felt clumsy. Her mind kept drifting back to the dense, black notes on the cream-colored paper. She would catch herself staring at the wall, her hands paused mid-motion, listening for a melody that wasn't there. The silence in her apartment, once a comforting blanket, now felt thin and stretched as if it were about to tear. The old man's words echoed in her head. Asterisk, the music doesn't care if you're afraid. It only wants to be heard. Asterisk, she hated him for putting this turmoil back into her life. She hated the manuscript for being so impossible. And most of all, she hated the small, treacherous part of her that was curious. She lasted 3 days. On the 4th evening, a steady rain tapped against her window, mirroring the restless drumming in her chest. She couldn't take it anymore. The book she was supposed to be restoring lay open on her bench, forgotten. With a sigh that felt like a surrender, she walked over to the table and picked up the manuscript. It was heavier than she expected. She carried it over to the corner of the room, to the shrouded piano. Her heart was beating a little faster now. She hadn't touched the white cloth in years. It was a layer of dust and memory, a barrier between her past and her present. She reached out a hand, her fingers hesitating for a moment before she gripped the edge of the cloth and pulled it away. A cloud of dust rose in the dim light, dancing in the air like tiny ghosts. The piano stood there, its black wood gleaming faintly. It looked the same, but it also looked like a stranger. A thin layer of dust coated the keys, turning their pure white a dull gray. She ran a finger over them, leaving a clean streak. It felt like a lifetime ago that these keys were an extension of her soul, that she could pour every joy, every sorrow, every complex thought into their ivory and ebony. She sat down on the worn bench, the wood groaning under her weight. She placed the manuscript on the music stand, the pages seeming to lean towards her, threatening to fall. Her hands hovered over the keys, trembling slightly. They felt stiff, foreign. She took a deep breath and tried to quiet the storm in her mind. Just try the first few bars, she told herself. Just to see what it sounds like. Her fingers found the opening chords. And what came out was not music. It was a noise. A jarring, clashing, ugly noise. The notes were all wrong, her timing was off, and the sound that filled the small apartment was like a cry of pain. She tried again, this time concentrating harder, her brow furrowed in effort. But it was no use. The piece was a tangle of thorns, a storm of black notes on the page that her fingers couldn't navigate. The rhythms were strange and unnatural, her left hand wanting to go in one direction while her right hand demanded another. It was like trying to pat your head and rub your stomach while riding a unicycle. She could feel the old panic starting to rise, a cold snake coiling in her stomach. The walls of her apartment seemed to be shrinking, the air getting thinner. It was the same feeling she used to get on stage, the feeling of 1,000 eyes on her, judging her, waiting for her to fail. Her hands began to sweat, making the keys slick. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps. She was no longer in her quiet apartment. She was back in a crowded concert hall, a young girl again, with the weight of the world on her shoulders. The more she fought the music, the more it fought back. The notes became a jumble of sound, a cacophony of her own failure. She could hear the old man's voice in her head. Not the gentle voice from the other day, but the sharp, demanding voice from her childhood. Asterisk faster, cleaner. Feel the music, don't just play the notes. But she couldn't feel it. All she could feel was the fear, or the cry of frustration that was part sob, part rage. She slammed both hands down on the keyboard, creating a deafening discord that hung in the air like a scream. Then she shoved the music stand, sending the manuscript flying across the room. Pages scattered like fallen leaves. She slammed the lid of the piano shut, the sound echoing the finality of her failure. She sat there, her head in her hands, her body shaking with silent sobs. She had failed. Just like she had failed all those years ago. The impossible piece had won, just as she knew it would. The quiet had been right all along. It was safer here. It was safer not to try. She sat like that for a long time. The rain still tapping at the window, the scattered pages of the manuscript lying on the floor around her like a battlefield. She was exhausted, drained. She felt hollowed out, emptied of everything but the familiar ache of regret. She was about to get up, to leave the disaster behind and go back to her books, when a single, clear note seemed to hang in the air after the chaos. It was a memory, a ghost of a note from the mess she had just made. It was a simple, haunting melody, a single clear voice in a riot. She hadn't really noticed it before, lost in the storm of impossible chords and confusing rhythms. But now, in the quiet aftermath, it was all she could hear. Slowly, she lifted her head. She looked at the scattered pages on the floor. One of them had landed near her feet, face up. Her eyes scanned the dense forest of notes, searching for that simple melody. And there it was. A small line of notes in the middle of a page, surrounded on all sides by chaos. It was a fragile little thing, a simple, sad tune that seemed to be hiding from the rest of the piece. She stared at it, her heart beating a little slower now. The panic was gone, replaced by a strange sense of wonder. She reached down and picked up the page, her fingers tracing the line of notes. She didn't think about it. She didn't let the fear creep back in. She just lifted the lid of the piano, her hands no longer trembling, and placed her fingers on the keys. She played the melody. It wasn't perfect. Her fingers were still stiff, her touch still rusty, but it was recognizable. It was a small, beautiful sound in the quiet room. She played it again, this time a little smoother. The notes hung in the air, pure and clear. It was a tiny victory, a small crack in the wall of the impossible. She wasn't thinking about the concert or the old man or the ghosts of her past. She was just a woman sitting at a piano, playing a simple, beautiful melody. And for the first time in a very long time, it felt like enough. The simple melody became her companion. In the days that followed, it was a constant, gentle presence in her quiet world. She hummed it while she carefully mended the spine of a worn-out novel, the tune a soft counterpoint to the creak of leather. She whistled it softly while measuring out a cup of tea, the notes rising like steam in the dim light of her kitchen. She didn't go back to the rest of the sonata. She wasn't ready. That one small, beautiful line of music was enough. It was a peace offering, a sign that the impossible score was not a monster, but something that held a secret beauty. It was the first friendly word in a language she had long forgotten, but the melody was also a question. It was a single, perfect sentence in a book that was otherwise written in a code she couldn't break. It felt like a key, but she didn't know what door it was supposed to open. She realized, one afternoon while staring at the intricate patterns of a book's endpapers, that she was going about it all wrong. She was a restorer. She didn't just force a broken book back together. She studied it. She learned about the paper, the ink, the binder who had made it. She understood its history before she even picked up a tool. To fix this music, she couldn't just use her fingers. She had to use her head and maybe even her heart. She put the piano aside for a week. It was a strange feeling to willingly ignore it after the battle she had just fought. Instead, she turned her small apartment into a research center. Her laptop, usually used for ordering rare supplies, now became her window into the life of Alistair Finch. She read old articles, grainy interviews, and biographies written by people who had tried to understand his genius. The picture that emerged was not of a madman, but of a man broken by sorrow. She learned about the great love of his life, a woman who had died suddenly in a car accident many years ago. She learned about his obsession with fragility, with things that are beautiful precisely because they can be so easily broken. He once said in an interview, "The most beautiful sound in the world is not a perfect chord, but the sound of something holding together by a thread, just before it shatters." Suddenly, the sonata made a new kind of sense. The chaotic, crashing chords weren't just difficult for the sake of being difficult. They were the sound of a heart breaking, the screech of tires on a wet road, the scream of grief. The impossible rhythms were the feeling of a mind trying to process an event that made no sense. And the simple melody she had found? It was his memory of her. It was the love that remained pure and clear, even in the midst of all that pain. The piece wasn't just the glass sonata. It was a story, a man's life etched in black and white on a page. Armed with this new understanding, she returned to the piano. Her approach was completely different. She was no longer a soldier trying to storm a castle. She was an archaeologist, carefully brushing away the dirt to uncover the artifact beneath. She didn't try to play the difficult passages. Instead, she deconstructed them. She would spend an entire afternoon on just 4 bars of music. First, she would ignore the notes completely and just tap out the rhythm on her workbench, her fingers drumming the complex polyrhythms on the worn wood until they felt natural. Then she would learn the notes for the left hand, playing them so slowly they sounded like a dirge. Then the right. She would hum the melody she knew while playing the chaotic bass line with her other hand. Trying to weave the two together. Her quiet nature, once a source of her stage fright, became her greatest strength. Her ability to focus for hours on a single, delicate task was perfectly suited to this new method. The world outside her window faded away. The only things that existed were her, the piano, and the story she was trying to tell. Her work as a book restorer bled into her practice. She was mending the broken phrases, coaxing the fractured melodies back into shape, and preserving the composer's original intent. She was no longer fighting the music. She was having a conversation with the ghost of Alistair Finch. There were still moments of frustration. Some passages were so dense and complex they felt like a solid wall, but she didn't slam the lid anymore. She would just take a deep breath, close the manuscript, and go back to it the next day with a clear head. She was patient. She was persistent. She was treating the sonata with the same gentle respect she would give a 500-year-old book. One evening, after weeks of this slow, meticulous work, something magical happened. She was working on a particularly vicious passage in the first movement, a cascade of notes that leaped across the keyboard like a fleeing animal. She had been practicing it for days, breaking it down into tiny, manageable chunks. She could play each chunk perfectly, but when she tried to link them together, it would fall apart. On this night, she wasn't even thinking about it. She was just tired, her fingers moving on autopilot, her mind somewhere else. She played through the difficult section, not even realizing she was doing it. And it worked. The notes flowed, not perfectly, but with a raw, visceral energy that took her breath away. It wasn't just a collection of correct notes. It was alive. It was the sound of anger and confusion and desperate, aching sadness. She stopped, her hands hovering over the keys, a wide smile spreading across her face. It was a quiet smile, a private one, but it was the first genuine smile she had felt in a very long time. She had done it. She had found a way through the storm. She looked at the manuscript, no longer seeing a forest of impossible notes, but a landscape she was learning to navigate. The fear was still there, a faint whisper in the back of her mind, but it was no longer a roaring monster. It was being replaced by something else, a quiet, unshakable confidence. The impossible was becoming possible, one small, hard-won victory at a time. The night of the concert arrived with a strange quiet. It was the same quiet that had always lived in her apartment, but now it was different. It was no longer a shield, but a deep, calm breath before a plunge. She went through her day as she always did, the familiar motions of her work a comforting anchor in a sea of unspoken nerves. She cleaned her tools, she organized her papers, she brewed a pot of tea. But underneath it all, a current of energy was humming. Every time she passed the piano, she felt a pull, a connection to the story she was about to tell. She didn't practice. There was nothing left to practice. The music was in her now, not just in her fingers, but in her bones. Getting ready was a simple affair. She chose a plain, dark dress, the kind of dress that wouldn't draw attention. She wasn't trying to be a star. She was just a messenger. The journey to the concert hall was a journey into another world. The city, which she usually viewed from the safety of her window, was a blur of lights and noise. The Grand Theater, with its towering columns and brightly lit marquee, felt like a palace from a fairy tale, a place where she didn't belong. As she walked through the ornate lobby, surrounded by people dressed in silk and velvet, talking in loud, excited voices, she felt a familiar tug of panic. She was a small, quiet creature who had stumbled into a world of giants. Backstage was even worse. It was a maze of narrow corridors, thick with the smell of dust, old wood, and floor wax. People rushed past her with important looks on their faces, carrying sheet music and instruments. The low rumble of the audience, thousands of people settling into their seats, was a constant, menacing growl. She found a small, dark corner and stood there, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The old fear returned, not as a whisper, but as a roar. It was cold and sharp, wrapping itself around her chest. Her hands felt like ice, and her breath came in short, shallow gasps. The faces of the people in the lobby, the expectations of the crowd, the memory of her past failure, it all swirled together in a dizzying, terrifying storm. She was a young girl again, paralyzed and alone. What was she doing here? She couldn't do this. She was going to fail just like before, in front of all these people, Just as the fear was about to swallow her whole, a familiar figure appeared out of the chaos. It was her old teacher. He looked at her, his eyes taking in her pale face and trembling hands. He didn't say, "Don't be nervous or you'll be great." He just stood there for a moment, his presence a solid, steady thing in the whirlwind of her fear. Then he spoke, his voice soft and clear. "Just tell the story," he said. "That's all you have to do. Just tell them his story." He gave her a small, gentle nod, then turned and walked away, leaving her with those simple words hanging in the air. Tell the story. It was like a key turning in a lock. The fear didn't disappear, but it shifted. It was no longer about her performance, about her success or failure. It was about Alistair. It was about his love and his pain. It was about the simple melody and the crashing chords. She was just the one chosen to speak for him. A stagehand appeared and touched her arm. "It's time," he said. She followed him down a short hallway and up a small set of stairs. The low rumble of the crowd suddenly faded into a thick, expectant silence. She stepped out onto the stage and into a blinding wall of light. She couldn't see the audience, just a vast, black emptiness beyond the lights. The world shrank to the size of the stage, to the single, gleaming black piano waiting for her in the center. The walk to the bench felt like the longest walk of her life. Each step was a deliberate act of leaving the past behind. She sat down, the velvet of the bench soft beneath her. She placed her hands on the keys, and for a moment they were still. She closed her eyes, and she wasn't in a grand concert hall anymore. She was in her small apartment, the rain tapping at the window, the manuscript on her stand. She remembered the simple melody, the story of the broken-hearted man, the weeks of slow, patient work. She took a deep breath as she began to play. The first notes were a declaration. They were quiet, but they were sure. The music that filled the hall was not the technically perfect, polished performance of a virtuoso. It was something else entirely. It was raw, it was human, it was real. As she moved into the chaotic, crashing passages, she wasn't just playing difficult notes. She was navigating a storm of grief. Her hands flew across the keyboard, not with the cold precision of a machine, but with the desperate energy of a heart trying to survive. The audience wasn't just listening to a sonata. They were feeling a man's world break apart. And then, through the chaos, the simple melody would emerge, clear and pure, like a single candle burning in a dark room. It was a moment of peace, a memory of love, a reminder of what was lost. The contrast was devastatingly beautiful. She lost herself in the music. She was no longer thinking about her fingers or the notes or the thousands of people listening. She was just a conduit, a channel for the story. The impossible stretches, the complex rhythms, the thunderous chords, she didn't conquer them, she survived them. She poured her own quiet strength, her own decades of solitude, her own hard-won peace into the music. It was her story and his story, all at once. When she reached the final, resonant chord, she held it, letting the sound fill the vast space. And then she let it go. There was a beat of profound, absolute silence. It was a silence so deep and so complete that it felt sacred. It was the sound of 1,000 people holding their breath, sharing a single, powerful moment. And then the silence was broken. The hall erupted in a roar of sound, a thunderous wave of applause that was so loud it was almost physical. It washed over her, a wave of affirmation, of release, of understanding. She sat there for a moment, her hands still on the keys, her head bowed. She slowly lifted her head and looked out into the blinding lights, a small, quiet smile on her face. She had faced the impossible, and in doing so she had finally found her own voice. The roar of the crowd was a physical thing, a warm, vibrating wall of sound that pressed in on her from all sides. It was a sound she had once feared more than anything, a sound that had the power to steal the air from her lungs and the strength from her hands. But now, as she sat on the polished bench, the final chord of the sonata still echoing in the vast space of the hall, the sound felt different. It wasn't a threat. It was an offering. It was the sound of thousands of people who had understood, who had felt the story she had told. She slowly lifted her hands from the keys and placed them in her lap. Her head was still bowed, She wasn't praying, but she felt a sense of reverence, a quiet gratitude for the man who had written the music and for the part she had played in setting it free. After a long moment, she stood up. The lights were still blinding, but she didn't shrink from them. She walked to the front of the stage, a small, dark figure against the immense grandeur of the hall. She didn't wave or throw kisses. She just stood there and gave a simple, deep bow. It was a bow of respect, not for the applause, but for the music, for the memory of the composer, and for the quiet girl she used to be. Then she turned and walked off the stage, the sound of the applause following her like a warm tide. Backstage, the chaos had intensified. People were congratulating her, patting her on the back, their faces alight with excitement. But their words were just noise, a distant hum. She moved through them with a strange sense of calm, a bubble of quiet surrounding her. Her old teacher was there, waiting for her by the exit. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her, his eyes shining with a pride that was deeper than any words. He simply placed a hand on her shoulder, a firm, steady pressure that said everything. She nodded once, a silent understanding passing between them. And then she was gone, stepping out into the cool night air and leaving the world of spotlights and applause behind her. The next few days were a blur. The silence of her apartment returned, but it was a new kind of silence. It was no longer an empty space waiting to be filled, but a full, resonant space, still humming with the energy of the performance. The piano stood in the corner, no longer a ghost, but a friend. She would look at it and feel a sense of quiet pride, a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with what anyone else thought. But the outside world was not content to let her be. The quiet was soon interrupted by the ringing of her phone, a sound she usually ignored. This time she answered. It was a journalist from a major newspaper. Then came the calls from concert halls in other cities, then other countries. Then the letters started arriving. Not just one or two, but piles of them. Her small mailbox overflowed, and a neat stack of envelopes began to grow on her kitchen table, right where the manuscript of the Glass Sonata had once lain. They were all offering her the world. Agents wanted to represent her, promising to make her a star. Record labels wanted to sign her, offering contracts that would guarantee her financial security for the rest of her life. Famous orchestras were inviting her to be a soloist, to play with them in the most prestigious venues in the world. It was everything the young girl with the fire in her fingers had ever dreamed of. It was the career she had lost, being handed back to her on a silver platter. She read the letters one by one. The language was always the same. Incredible talent, once-in-a-generation performance, a brilliant career ahead of you. They saw her as a phenomenon, a prodigy rescued from obscurity. They saw the concert as a beginning, but for her it felt like an ending. She had done what she set out to do. She had told Alistair's story. She had faced her greatest fear and found that she was stronger than it. The applause was a wonderful gift, a confirmation of her journey, but it wasn't the destination. She tried to imagine herself on that path. She saw herself getting on planes, staying in sterile hotel rooms, walking onto unfamiliar stages night after night. She saw herself practicing for hours, not for the love of the music, but to please the critics, to live up to the expectations. It felt like a cage, just as gilded as the one she had been in before, but a cage nonetheless. One afternoon, she sat down at her piano. She pulled out an old book of music, a piece by a famous composer that she had played as a teenager, a piece full of technical fireworks and dazzling runs. Her fingers, now so familiar with the raw emotion of the Glass Sonata, felt clumsy and disconnected. She played the notes, but there was no feeling, no story. It was just a collection of sounds, clever and impressive, but empty. She stopped mid-phrase, her hands resting on the keys. She realized then that she could never go back to being that kind of pianist. The experience had changed her irrevocably. It wasn't about conquering the music anymore. It was about understanding it. In the end, she didn't call any of the agents or concert halls. She let the stack of letters on her table grow, a monument to a life she chose not to live. She went back to her work, to the quiet, meticulous world of book restoration. Her hands found their old rhythm, and the familiar comfort of mending broken things returned. But something was different. She was different. The fear was gone. The quiet was no longer a refuge, but a choice. It was a space she had curated for herself, a space filled with peace and the memory of the music. A few weeks later, her old teacher came to visit. He found her in her apartment, not hunched over her workbench, but sitting at her piano. He expected to see the manuscript of another impossible, challenging piece on the music stand. But instead, there was just a single, clean sheet of paper with a few lines of handwritten notes. She was playing a new melody. It was a simple, quiet tune, clear and unadorned. It wasn't flashy or technically difficult. It was just honest. It was a melody that sounded like her quiet apartment, like the rain on the window pane, like the feeling of a hard-won piece. He stood in the doorway and listened, a slow, gentle smile spreading across his face. She had faced the impossible and had not been broken by it. She had not become a star. She had become herself, and the music she was creating now, in the quiet of her own world, was more beautiful than anything she could have ever played on a grand stage.